all know by now how variables are declared in ES5 and earlier versions of JavaScript. But what about ES6? What does ES6 bring to the table? And ES6 is concerned with scope in terms of variables. Variables are what's called function scoped. And what that means is no matter where you declare your variable inside your function, you always have access to that variable, even if you shouldn't. So as an example of that, let's write a really simple function here called function say hi. And as you can imagine, this function is just going to say hi. And let's say we have a Boolean check here. So we'll just have like a simple if statement, which is just going to check if something is true, I should do this. So let's say var should say hi equals true. Okay, so it should say hi, and we can just check if this variable is true or not. Right? So if should say hi equals true, and technically we don't need to say equals true. You could just say if should say hi, but anyway, if should say hi equals true, then we'll declare a variable here. So var my name equals Chris. Okay, cool. And we can then console.log hi plus, you know what, let's be consistent. We use double quotes everywhere instead of single quotes some places and double quotes other places. Hi space plus my name. Okay, no issues here, nothing wrong going on. So let's invoke the function, say hi, we'll run it. Okay, hi Chris, that totally works just fine. Now, what about if we try to access this variable outside the scope of this if statement? Theoretically speaking, that shouldn't be possible, right? We're not declaring the variable until this block, this is called a block here, until this block is invoked. But the way that variables work in ES5, and in fact all versions of JavaScript, even in ES6, if you declare a variable, it'll work this way. You do have access to this variable outside of that scope, provided you're in the same function. So if I take this out and I move it outside of this block, so you know what, let's put some lines in between so we can kind of tell it apart. So this should kind of stand on its own. But if I say down here, okay, console log this plus my name, and you know what, my linter is telling me right off the bat, hey, this is out of scope, and it's totally correct to do so. However, this is valid JavaScript. This will work. So if I clear this and run it again, and I'll save it for good measure, run it, we see that it is working. Right? We have access to a variable where really we probably shouldn't. And as you can imagine, this can cause some headaches down the road. So if you have a really complicated function and you have a bunch of nested if statements, for example, and at some point you need to check that variable, or you accidentally reassign the variable, that could be a real nightmare. Right? So if you say, for example, here, my name equals Bob, here we're accessing a variable that we shouldn't have yet, right? It's dependent on should say hi. So if we clear it, we run it again, right? It changed to Bob, which is not really good, right? So we declare it here. It just kind of runs sequentially. We declare it, and then we reassign it to a new value. Then we console log that out, and now we are having an unintended consequence, right? Because this variable is scoped to the entire function. To show even further how this could be bad, if we say should say hi true, var really say hi equals true, right? So let's nest this even deeper. So I'll get rid of some of this code here. So here we say var my name equals Chris, and then we say if really say hi equals true. We'll declare another variable, var my last name equals, just to make something up, Smith. Right, so again, this variable, even though it's kind of nested deeper inside the if statement, and if your eyes are kind of crossing, I don't blame you, but even though this variable is declared deeper within this if statement, I do have access to it within the scope of the function. Right, so here I can reassign it. My last name equals Jones, for example. And again, my linter is telling me that, hey, this is out of scope, But again, this is valid JavaScript. It's not going to crash. I can see my last name, and it looks like it's still running the older code here. So run it. Okay, let's console log hi plus my name plus my last name. Right, we don't have any spaces in here, but just to demonstrate this, hi Chris Jones. Right, so this is kind of a pain. What if you have tons of nested stuff going on in your function? You do have access to the variable outside the scope. Not really an ideal situation. And if you try to access the variable outside the scope of the function, it's not going to work. So instead of say hi here, let's try to access console.log my name. Let's see what happens here. Clear, run. Of course, it crashes because my name is not defined at this point in our program. And even if you move this down to after invoking the function, it's still going to fail, right? Because they're trying to access something outside of the scope. So clear, run, right? So error, my name is not defined, right? Let me save that and run it again, right? So hi Chris Jones. So this runs, and then this line of code runs, and of course my name is not defined outside of this function. So this tells you a couple things. First of all, you should really be careful with globally declaring variables. You should do it as least, the least amount as possible, because if I did declare my name at the very top, there's not necessarily anything wrong with that, but you should always be careful in terms of scoping your app, your functions. They should be kind of as minimally scoped as possible. And on the other hand, you do have to be aware that variables, they do get scoped to the function. Now that brings us to some ES6 code finally. So ES6 code introduces let, which is kind of in contrast to var. So let me rewrite some of this using let instead. And I'm going to get rid of console log down here. So let's say, let's keep var should say hi, should really say hi, but let's say we make my name into a let instead of var. So we're declaring this now like a variable, and it, for all intents and purposes, acts like a variable, with the exception that let is scoped to the block, right? So recall that this, and I'll get rid of this, a couple lines of code here, actually. Okay, we'll get rid of my last name, like so. So let is scoped to the block, and the block being, this line of code that follows an if statement. So I will not have access to my name outside of this block. Meaning, if I try to run this code, it's going to crash. Let's see what happens. We'll run, error, my name is not defined. Right? So this is going to help us a lot in terms of scoping out our app or our function or whatever it may be. Right? So here we are declaring it. If we want to say console log my name inside the block, that will totally work. Right? So like so. We'll clear it, we'll run it. Totally works, right? And you know what? Let's add a space here just for aesthetic reasons. Plus, right? So we can run it, and it works. We do not have access to this variable outside of this particular block, right? So that's really key to understand when it comes to let. And that doesn't mean you can't kind of filter it down. So if I declare it at the top of this function, for example, let, and if I wanted to console log out one of those, for example, should say hi instead of hi my name. Right? Let's see if this works. We'll clear it, we'll run it again. True. Right? So this block is still within the context of this function block. Therefore, I do have access down the road, but I can't pass anything I declare back up out of the block. We can see that let behaves more strictly than var. And another common thing that you might see with lets is, you just declare the let statement, so let my name, for example, and then just not assign it a value until later. And this is totally valid as well. And this is something that you should get into the habit of if you are conditionally declaring a variable. And when I say variable in this circumstance, I'm referring to a let statement. So looks like my spacing is a little weird there. Okay. So you declare let my name, and then based on one of these conditions, you then declare you assign it a value conditionally. This is an if statement, which if you're not sure what an if statement is, we will get into that later on. But this would basically say, if this is true, do this thing. To this, we can add an else. In other words, if this is true, do this, otherwise do something else. And then we assign this variable a different value. Right? So let's say, in this case, we say hi, oops, should be in quotes, hi, plus space, plus my name. And down here, you can also say console log hi, plus space, plus my name. Right? And we're just kind of reusing this let statement based on whatever our conditional factor is. Right? So in this case, if I clear it, run it again, it says hi Chris. If I switch this flag, it looks like we're not really using really say hi anymore. But if this statement is now evaluated to be false, well, let's see what happens. So we'll clear it, we'll run it. Right? So now we see that it's kind of been renamed. And this is pretty common, I would say, if you are kind of conditionally using one of these let variables. And the fact that it's block scoped, it just kind of makes sense to my mind. It helps keep the effects of code fragments, more local, and it's more common in terms of programming languages to kind of restrict it to block scoping. Next, I would like to get into const. So in addition to let, ES6 also introduces const. In other words, a constant. And const functions very similar to let in the fact that it's block scoped and you can't have access to the constant outside of the block. One major difference, however, is that const cannot be reassigned. In other words, you use it for, say, a string or data that you don't ever want to reassign. So here, we are declaring let my name. At one point, we're assigning it one value. Another point, we're assigning it another value. With const, that is not allowed. So for example, if I try to change this from let to const my name, and you do have to initialize it with a value. So let's say my name is Chris, for example. Here I'm trying to reassign something that I'm not allowed to override. And if I hover over my linter, it's telling me, hey, you're attempting to override my name, which is a constant, and you can't actually do that. Right? So let's see what happens if we run. It doesn't really work. So it's catching it before it runs. It's not compiling properly. And const, if we get rid of some of this code, if we want to demonstrate this, we can try it again here, const, and you may occasionally see, all uppercase, my name, like this. This is kind of a convention where you want to indicate that it is a const, and you can follow this or not, but if you do see it, just understand that it's kind of convention. For the purpose of this example, I'm not going to bother, but so anyway, we say const my name. This function is essentially like a let or a var. Right? We can declare it like this. We can const log it out, but again, we can't reassign it. So we can't say my name equals something else now. It doesn't work. It's not happy with that. It doesn't allow us to reassign it. And at this point, if I try to console log my name, well, what do you expect it'll show? It doesn't run at all because we're trying to reassign a const. It's kind of throwing an error that we're not really seeing right now in the console. Right, and that's something that ES6 is really good at. So let and const, they generally are quicker to throw exceptions, to throw errors if you're doing something you shouldn't be doing. Right, my linter is happening. It does happen to tell me what's wrong here, but generally you would need to know, oh, right, I can't reassign a constant here. Now, that's not to say that a constant is immutable. In other words, it doesn't mean you can't transform some data stored in a constant. And what I mean by that is, let's take a look at an array. My array equals. And array is just a collection of values. So let's say we have an array with the numbers 1, 2, and 3. So I can't reassign it. So I can't give it a new array, 4, 5, 6. That doesn't work. Right? Again, it's telling me, hey, you can't override my array. That's a constant. Again, if we try to console log it out, let's see what happens. Whoops. Put that there. Nothing, right? Makes sense because it's kind of throwing an error in the background. But we can sort of mutate this original data. So this is a pointer to this particular, whoops, I opened the dictionary. So this is basically a pointer to this array. And what we can do is we can modify this original data. And if you're not aware of how to manipulate data structures, the way we can add to an array in JavaScript, one way anyway, is we can push data into it. So for example, we say my array dot push, and if I wanted to push a number into the array, let's say I wanted to push the number 4, right? So let's console log this out. So first of all, I'm going to get rid of this. We'll console log my array so we can take a look at it, right? And as you expect, it's just going to show the array 1, 2, 3, 4. But if we need to modify the data inside this existing data structure, that is possible. And whoops, shouldn't have done const. I want to do my array dot push. We can push a number into the array, and then we can console log that again, my array. Clear it, we'll run it again, and we can see that we did alter the original data. So this is kind of a common misconception with constants. So you can't reassign it to an entirely different value, but you can kind of mutate the original data. So here we're pushing into a data structure that's been defined already, right? So if you think of this as like a pointer in memory to this particular thing, that kind of makes sense, right? So we're modifying this original thing. We're not reassigning the value of my array here, for example. And it works very similar for objects as well. So if we eliminate some of this code, we say const my object, right? And let's say we have an object that just stores a name value, for example. So we can say name Chris, right? If we console log the object out, my object, clear it, we'll run it again, right? We see that we have name Chris. I can't reassign it to a new object, right? I can't do my object equals name Bob. It's not going to let me do that because I'm trying to reassign to a new value for object. But I can change the data within the object, right? So I can say my object dot name. This is how you can kind of manipulate an object in JavaScript, equals Bob, right? So let's see what happens at this point if we console log my object. We'll clear it, we'll run it again. Okay, so we can see that originally it was Chris and then it was reassigned to Bob. Now the pointer, it's not pointing to the data inside, it's pointing to the fact that this is an object itself, right? And then we're changing the value of what's stored within this particular object. So kind of tough to wrap your head around a little bit in terms of const, but as you can imagine, this is pretty useful, right? So if you're just assigning it a string or an object or an array, you just have to understand what const is doing for us. So you can sort of consider it immutable in a way, but the data inside can be changed. You just can't reassign it. And that's really the major difference when it comes to let and const. They're pretty similar, except for that fact. Now, if you want to see const in action in the context of scope, we can take a look at that as well. So, let's say we have function, say hi again. Say hi, and what this function does is we can just always make it true, but we'll do a check. If true, this will always just trigger, but basically in this block we can declare a constant. So const my name equals Jim, for example. So const is block scoped as well to this block, and if I try to access this constant outside of the block, it's not going to work. Right? Console log my name, and I won't have access to this outside of the scope. Let's try it out. So we'll invoke the function say hi, clear it, we'll run it again. Error, my name is not defined. Right? So that's how that works. If we wanted to access this inside the scope, of course, we can just move that line of code inside there. Run it, and now we can do it. Otherwise, it is block scoped just like a let. Another neat thing that we don't really have to worry about anymore with block scoping is if you do happen to use the same const name, and my linter probably won't be happy with it, but if I say const my name equals Jane, for example, so my linter is telling me, hey, you already used that, so it's kind of throwing an error there. But technically speaking, what do you expect to happen here if I run this function? let's find out. So we'll run it. We can see that it's showing me my name down here, right? Because it's within the context of this block here, right? So we're declaring it up right at the entry point of our function. We do have access to it at any point down the line. And it's not really good practice, but if you do happen to have, not advisable, but a huge function with tons of different constants going on, this is going to help you kind of minimize it, keep it scoped to whatever scope you need it to be. Right? So if we do a console log in here, for example, my name, it's clear, we'll run it again, we can see that we do have access to two different versions of my name, and it's just kind of relevant within whatever scope it's in. Another thing to know about const is you do have to give them a value right off the bat. If I just try to leave it blank, just initialize it like this, it's not going to be happy. Right? We can't initialize these to undefined like we can for let. So if I said let here, that would be acceptable, but I can't do that with const. I do need to assign it a value. And again, usually your linter will tell you if you are having issues with that. So that's the basics of variables, let and const. Now you should have a good understanding to be able to use these. And in general, my advice would be whenever you can, use a const. So if you know your data is not going to change, you should always be preferring to use const. Otherwise, if you do have a value that you need to change later on, use let. Or if you have a value that you're not sure you're going to need and you just need to initialize something, even if it's undefined, use let for that. In general, you can avoid var for the most part. Let and const kind of take over what var used to do, and they're more precise because of their block scoping. So if for whatever reason you really need to use a var, go right ahead. But in general, I would say prefer const. Wherever you can't do that, use let and var as a last resort.